So our speaker today is Ryan Hackenbracht, who came to Texas Tech, I think, a year after I did. Are you in your fifth year now?
Sixth.
Your sixth year, okay. Sixth year. Tenure track here. So give him a big hand. It's going to count the amount. We have an applause meter, and how he does on the applause meter will be a major factor in determining that decision. So, Professor Hackenbracht is an expert on the 16th century and the 17th century, on Milton, particularly on writers of the later part of the Renaissance, Locke and Hobbes, who he will be addressing today. I noted that he's interested in pop culture as well, and I noted that he had won in 2013, the Natalie Zeman Davis Award, and she's an interesting crossover figure between scholarly and pop culture, because she's one of the very few people ever to write a scholarly book that was then turned into a movie. The Return of Martin Guerre. It's a French film, and she was actually in it as a kind of, she wasn't a walk-on, she was seated in a kind of audience watching the trial that culminates the film. So we expect no less from you, and I'm sure you will find his talents as he lectures today, his thespian talents, to be of the highest. Yes?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's give him a big hand so he gets that tenure. All yours.
Well, this is a good size for Monday night at 5:30. I was helping, I think it was about a year ago now, I had an undergraduate student I was helping apply to graduate programs, and I told her that she had to go to this big Milton conference and give a paper so that this would, boost her CV, she could get into some good grad programs. And she was very patient for months. She didn't question me about giving the paper or anything. And then about a week before she was going to go to this, I said, do you have any final questions? And she said, how many people will there be in the audience? Like 100 or 200 or something like that? And I said, well, she says, from the talks I've seen with like TED Talks, there's a lot of people in the audience. And I said, God bless you. No, not in the humanities as much. Working on the Bible and literature is a really interesting and exciting topic. I'm currently teaching the Bible as literature for the second semester, which is a really interesting experience. I had one student from last semester catch me like a week or two ago in the gym and sort of grabbed me by the shoulder and said, Ryan, I'm not religious, but I loved the shit out of your Bible class. I had another student last semester catch me after class and ask me very seriously, what do you think God is telling me to do with my life? And I paused for a second and I thought, and I said, well, have you thought about becoming an English major? And she sort of walked away at that point. Anyway, so today I want to talk about the Bible and political philosophy and Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. On June 14th of this year, and amid the ongoing debate over illegal immigration, amid the ongoing debate over illegal immigration, the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, held a public news conference where he defended his policy of separating immigrant children from their parents as both lawful and necessary. I would cite you the Apostle Paul and his clear and wise command in Romans 13, Sessions said, which reads, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. A passage of some serious historical weight, since it had been used by American slave owners prior to the Civil War. People immediately leapt both to defend and to attack Sessions, and his quotation set the media world ablaze. When asked about Sessions' quote in a White House press conference, Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders said she agreed with Sessions and remarked it is very biblical to enforce the law. Similarly, when people pointed out that Jesus was a refugee and an immigrant, televangelist Paula White, who serves as President Trump's spiritual counsel, one of several, insisted that when Jesus and his family had lived in Egypt for those 3 years, they must have immigrated legally, although we have no evidence in either direction. If he had broken the law, she said, then that would have been sinful, and he would not have been our Messiah. Still yet, Stephen Colbert, a late-night talk show host and an outspoken Catholic, he actually teaches Sunday school to little kids at his Catholic parish, quoted the Bible back to Jeff Sessions, pointing out that had the Attorney General read a few verses further in the exact same chapter in Romans, he would have read, "Whatever commandments there are, they are summed up in this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Love is therefore the fulfillment of the law." By this logic, Colbert suggested Christians are actually compelled to defend their neighbors, since that is what the law of grace instructs them to do. And the thing that I find so intriguing about this debate is that no matter which side you stood on during it or how you felt about the matter, many of the people involved resorted to the same text, the Bible, when defending or refuting Sessions' statement. Suddenly, this first-century tent maker, the Apostle Paul, had become central to a 21st century discussion of what a government can and cannot do, and when, if ever, it's lawful to resist an oppressive government. One of the odd things about the debates, in other words, was that a religious text became a unanimous authority on a secular issue, something that theoretically was outside the purview of churches and pews and belonged to the realm of politicians and jurists. America, in particular, was founded on the notion of the separation of church and state, and so to see a religious text used in this way for a political matter strikes us as a little bit weird. I'd like to suggest, however, that the Bible has long informed Western notions of obedience to the government, and that the epistles or letters of St. Paul in particular are central to our American ideas of liberty and political activism. In other words, though he didn't realize it probably when he was quoting Paul, Jeff Sessions was participating in a long tradition going back to the 17th century of using Paul's writings to define the relationship between citizens and their government. The debate over what Paul meant about obeying the authorities and how that might apply to Christians living in a political society is an old controversy, not a new one that stretches back at least as far as the two philosophers who laid the foundation for modern politics, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. So over the course of this talk, I'd like to dig into the debate between them over obedience to the government and the responsibility of Christians to protect their neighbors, gesturing at the end toward the American founding fathers, namely Jefferson and Madison, who were deeply influenced by their ideas. The Bible, I'd like to show, has more to do with government than we might realize, and secularism, as far as the successful separation of state from the church and of politics from religion, is a myth. Sessions' quotation is evidence that the politics of Paul, for instance, are still alive and well in American society today, and that try though we might, some of us, to escape it, our Christian heritage has come to bear on our political policies, and it will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. The 17th century debate over obedience to the government followed in the aftermath of an unprecedented civil war in England. Parliament accused the king of acting without parliamentary consent, and the king, in response, raised his royal standard in a declaration of war, a war that Parliament eventually won. After keeping Charles in prison for several years, they eventually held a trial and dethroned and executed Charles I. This is a close-up. You can see Charles's head. This was done actually the same year, 1649, that he was executed. You can see Charles's head and somebody holding the severed head, and there's blood spurting. I mean, it's extremely gory, even for the 17th century. And you probably can't see it from where you're looking, but down in the very front row, there are people with their hands raised, but in their hands they're holding something, and they're holding handkerchiefs. And what they're trying to do is lean forward and see if they can get just a little bit of the royal blood in their handkerchief, because that's how highly monarchy was venerated at the time. You know, that he was practically a kind of demigod or something amongst them. And some people write in their journals about how they were successful in getting some of the blood, and then they keep it as a family heirloom, pass it down for generations afterward. And over here on the right is a close-up of Charles's head with blood dripping from it and everything. And there's been a lot of work done on how this sort of spectacle is, yeah, thanks, Steve. This sort of spectacle is, it's not just something they did for fun or because they didn't have Netflix. It was because it's a way to reinforce in this case, parliamentary authority, right? You look at this and you decide that, well, maybe it's not such a good idea to wage war against Parliament. Maybe I'll just be a good boy and behave. So anyway, in this event, the execution of Charles shocked all of Europe, which would not see its like again until Robespierre's reign of terror in the French Revolution. As in all civil wars, during the English Revolution, the government was divided, and different factions vied for power in the absence of a monarch. All of this matters a great deal for Hobbes and Locke because they both lived through the English Revolution. Hobbes was a young man. Locke was, I think, 9 years old when the war broke out, and it had a formative influence on their political thinking. Viewing the chaos of the civil wars from his self-imposed exile in Paris, the monarchist Thomas Hobbes wrote a massive and highly controversial political treatise called Leviathan. Hobbes is one of the more fascinating characters of the 17th century. His father was a failed priest who disgraced the family when he slandered the priest of a neighboring parish and refused to make a public apology, even though the bishop had ordered him to do this. His son Thomas attended Oxford, which at the time was where you went if you were a royalist and in support of the king, whereas radical Republicans and parliamentarians like Milton and Marvell, they went to Cambridge. Hobbes was a close friend of William Cavendish, the Marquis of Newcastle, one of Charles's generals during the Civil Wars, and a staunch royalist. Hobbes's great work, Leviathan, would contain a number of radical ideas certain to irritate Puritans, Republicans, Royalists, and just about everyone. Hobbes argued, for instance, based on his own interpretation of Old Testament passages, that, quote, to God is attributed motion and place, which is as much as saying that God has a body and that he's residing somewhere in the universe. Hobbes was also one of the first people to argue that heaven and hell, as actual locations, either on earth or in some other dimension, don't really exist, and that they're really just metaphors for states of closeness or distance from God. And if these sorts of claims raise eyebrows in the 21st century, you can imagine the effect they had on Christian readers in 17th century England. Hobbes was soon branded, quote, the Antichrist, which is kind of unoriginal, prophet of Satan, which is better, I think, atheist, and for many centuries later, he's been misunderstood as an advocate of atheism and secularism. And it's really only in the past, 15, 20 years that Hobbes scholars have started to recover these religious aspects of his writing because he was, denigrated at the time by his opponents as an atheist, as a secularist, and he just continued like that, even in scholarly opinion, for centuries after his death. But all of this overlooks the fact that Hobbes often bases his political theories on scriptural passages and uses his considerable skill in Greek — he was one of the top Greek scholars of his generation — to exegete difficult New Testament passages. If he actually was an atheist and a secularist, then why bother? Why take the time, tedious as it would have been, and I can speak from experience, it is tedious, to parse the exact meanings of key Greek words if he didn't actually care about the Bible or the accuracy of his scriptural interpretations. On the contrary, Hobbes shows himself quite intent on figuring out the exact meanings of key passages in Scripture and then carrying them out to a logical conclusion in his political theory. So one example of this is his use of Paul and Paul's injunction for Christians to, quote, submit themselves to the governing authorities, the same passage Jeff Sessions had quoted in defense of his immigration policies. Now, Leviathan, if you haven't read it, advocates a kind of Orwellian vision of absolute government in which the ruler, or sovereign as he's often called, holds a despotic authority over his subjects who have ceded all rights they naturally possess as citizens, no less as human beings, to him. The treatise was Hobbes's response to the crisis of the Civil Wars, which is why he wrote it in English rather than in Latin. If the absence of a monarch leads to strife and turmoil, then the answer for Hobbes was clearly to stitch the monarch back into the fabric of government in such a way that he could never again be ripped from it. And you can sort of see what he's done here as far as having the sovereign be made up of all of these tiny people who constitute the citizens in the Commonwealth. One way of looking at this is that, well, it's a kind of social contract and they're complicit in his rule and stuff. A more Hobbesian way of looking at it is to say that he subsumes them, right? That he takes whatever sort of political agency or right or power they have and simply allocates it to himself and makes himself the sole ruler. Hobbes accomplishes this in part by quoting extensively from Paul and transforming the apostles' exhortation to submit themselves to the governing authorities into a defining feature of godly citizenship in his own idea of government. For instance, in the chapter section titled Sovereign and Subject, What They Are, Hobbes defines the relationship between the two as an act of the people's submission to the sovereign. Can you read that? Okay. Well, I'll read it to you if you can't. And he that carrieth this person is called the sovereign, and said to have sovereign power, and everyone beside his subject. The attaining to the sovereign power is by two ways. One is by natural force, as when a man makes his children to submit themselves, and their children to his government, as being able to destroy them if they refuse. The other is when men agree amongst themselves to submit to some man or assembly of men voluntarily on confidence to be protected by him against all others. Many of Hobbes's philosophical contemporaries define this relationship as a social contract, as I was just saying, a cooperation, in other words, between the citizens and their sovereign. But for Hobbes, it's specifically a submission, which happens to be exactly how Paul describes a Christian's relationship to the government and people around him. Submit yourselves to the governing authorities, Paul says in Romans, for there's no authority except that which God has established. And here are some other key passages. Submit is a favorite word of Paul's. For those classicists among us, if you're probably wondering, the word is hupotasso. You know that, I'm sure. Anyway, now I'm just inviting a Greek question. Submit yourselves to one another in the fear, submit yourselves to other Christians and to everyone who joins in the work and labors at it. Submit yourselves to one another in the fear of God. Wives, submit to your husbands as unto the Lord. Obey them that rule over you and submit yourselves. The book of Hebrews is actually, we know now that it was not written by Paul, but at the time they thought that it was written by Paul. Essentially, Hobbes is co-opting Paul's teachings and using it to reinforce his own idea that a ruler's power over his citizens should be absolute, even tyrannical. Consequently, if you're reading Leviathan in Hobbes's England and you believe in the biblical passages he's quoting, as just about everybody would have done, then suddenly obedience to Paul's teachings becomes obedience to Hobbes's teachings, which is obedience to the sovereign, regardless of how bad he might be. Hobbes even addresses the possibility of having a bad sovereign, and he writes, "But a man may here object that the condition of subjects is very miserable, as being obnoxious to their lusts and other irregular passions of him or them that have so unlimited a power in their hands. And commonly, they that live under a monarch think it's the fault of a monarchy, and they that live under a democracy think it's democracy's fault, and all of this leads to the horrors that accompany a civil war." But Hobbes's response to this, essentially, what if we have a bad sovereign, is Pauline. Paul wrote, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except that which God has established." And he added that those people who did oppose the governing authorities were bringing damnation upon themselves. Hobbes says essentially the same thing. A bad government is better than no government at all, and a monarchy is better than anarchy. And so it's best simply to submit yourselves to the governing authorities, regardless of how badly they mistreat you. Now here we arrive at a big difference between Paul's idea of obedience on the one hand and Hobbes's idea of obedience. For Paul, the reason you submit to the governing authorities is not only because God has put these people in charge, but because Christ is, as he says, in the world but not of it. The Christian has more important concerns, right? That concern is primarily to love one another, to share Christian grace. But Hobbes is different. For Hobbes, you should obey the sovereign not because it allows you to be a better Christian, but because the sovereign is your God in this life. The sovereign is, as Hobbes calls him, the Deus Mortalis, the mortal God, and it's to him that you owe your allegiance as long as you live. The Pauline notion of loving your neighbor doesn't even make it into Leviathan, and I believe the reason why is because it has the potential to be politically explosive. If you put one commandment above all others and say, well, it's going to be this, people can take that and do whatever they want with it. Hobbes doesn't mention loving your neighbor, I would suggest, for the same reason Jeff Sessions didn't mention it. If all you want is for people to be obedient to the government, then you just stop quoting Paul after he says submit to the governing authorities. But while Hobbes ignores this part of Paul's teaching, a generation later, the philosopher John Locke would focus on it and make it an important part of his political system. As John Parkin says, Hobbes was, quote, too useful to ignore, but too dangerous to leave unchallenged. And subsequent philosophers both opposed Hobbes and quietly integrated some of his own methods and concepts into their political philosophies. Locke is often heralded as the founder of liberalism in the West, the core doctrine of which is that you, as a citizen, have, quote, certain unalienable rights, as Jefferson put it in the Declaration of Independence, from which you cannot be divorced. These rights cannot be taken away from you, and the sole reason that government exists is to serve you and to protect those rights that you possess, not, as Hobbes would have it, so that you can sacrifice them to the good of the state and for the good of the sovereign. Locke's life is in many ways the opposite of Hobbes. Hobbes was a royalist with royalist friends, but Locke's father served in the Civil Wars as a captain on the side of Parliament. Hobbes's father was a Church of England clergyman, which is to say he's a high churchman. But Locke's family were Puritans and opposed hierarchical church government. In his philosophy, Hobbes was all about centralizing control in a powerful figure, the sovereign. Locke, by contrast, was concerned with democratizing government so that the individual citizens, not the sovereign, hold the power of the state. Locke found Hobbes's political philosophy abhorrent because it deprived the citizen of everything, rights, authority, and self-respect, and, quote, makes them a slave, according to Locke, to a government that actually ought to serve the citizens. But at the same time, the men were quite similar. Both served as academic tutors and teachers. Both bitterly opposed scholasticism and promoted humanism, which is the study of classical learning and languages in addition to Christian theology. And both were some of the most skilled Greek scholars of their day and would have been quite familiar not only with the Greek of the New Testament, which is very easy compared to other Greek texts, but with Paul's writings and with Paul's particular word choice. Both, moreover, found Paul's ideas very useful for their own day, and they adapted concerns from his letters to describe the function of government and the extent of a citizen's liberty. And whereas Hobbes used Paul to promote an idea of submission to the sovereign, Locke would use Paul's idea of, quote, loving your neighbor to encourage what we might call holy disobedience to an unjust government that gets in the way of that injunction. Liberty, Locke preaches, is not something people can choose to have. In the Second Treatise of Government, a text that deeply influenced Thomas Jefferson, Locke wrote that, quote, no man can give another power over his life. Liberty, Locke says, is something all people have simply by virtue of their humanity and what he saw as the image of God within them. And so, defending the liberty of your neighbors is not just an option for you in a Christian society, but a compulsion. Perhaps most importantly, Locke, like Hobbes, has been misunderstood as a secular figure. Part of the work we have to do as literary critics and historians is the excavation of culture. Situating Locke within his cultural context, in other words, can help us recover his actual attitudes towards politics and religion, which can then help us better understand where we come from ideologically today. And even in his own day, there were some concerns about Locke's commitment to Christianity. One example I have for you comes from a book that's at the Folger Shakespeare Library. That's a copy of, if I remember right, I think it's Locke's second treatise. And I'll blow that up for you. So you can see Locke here. He's actually saying something about how tradition just tends to deteriorate the more it gets passed down through the centuries. And his point is actually very Protestant. His point is that because tradition is unreliable, tradition being something that the Roman Catholics relied upon for their faith, what should we look to instead? The Bible, right? The Bible doesn't change. We should be reading the Bible. And this reader actually misinterprets what he's saying and says, I do not like, yeah, you can sort of, this is a nice thing about 17th century handwriting is it's not quite so cryptic as 16th century or medieval, and you can kind of read it even without all that much training, which is good for me because I'm not very good at paleography. I do not like this, for though it has seeming truth. Thank you. Though it has seeming truth, on its sides, yet does it
Make of the Christian religion, maybe?
no, it's not make. It's I read this like 2 hours ago. I know what it says. Yet does it
Strike.
Thank you. Yeah, yet does it strike out the Christian religion root and branch, which makes sense, root and branch. You're extirpating something entirely. Thanks, Steve. For us as scholars, an awareness of the biblical resonances in writing from this period opens up a whole discursive network of allusions, references, and citations that we tend to miss in the 21st century. In my book that's coming out this spring, I talk, for instance, about how there is a sort of vocabulary of religious belief, which is a quote from a famous 20th century literary critic, Rosamund Tuve. There's a sort of vocabulary of religious belief that we've simply lost in the 21st century because people are not growing up, reading the Bible. And I don't think that this is necessarily a bad thing, but I think that it's an obstacle to be overcome if you're trying to get back into that culture. Many families in Locke's day could only afford one book, and that was the Bible. They learned to read out of it, and more importantly, they learned to memorize massive chunks of it. We find passages from diaries and journals noting that so-and-so has memorized the entire book of Matthew, the whole book of Revelation. Yeah, I wish that I had saved some of these when I come across them, but there's so much to record, it's hard to get everything. So you can just sort of imagine the kind of impact that would have had on your thinking if you learned how to read out of the Bible and grew up memorizing the Bible and whole books of it, and that was the only book that your family had. Accordingly, we find Paul's fingerprints all over Locke's philosophy. Whereas Hobbes praised the human sovereign as a deus mortalis, a mortal god, Locke is quick to point out that we are all, quote, the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, all the servants of one sovereign master, sent into the world by his order and about his business. They are his property, whose workmanship they are made to last during his, not another's pleasure. Locke's statement echoes of such Pauline phrases as, we're God's offspring, and, quote, we're his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works. As Locke would have it, because we are God's workmanship, and because God is sovereign over human authorities, we have an obligation to protect the image of God in ourselves and in our neighbors. Man being born, he writes, with the title to perfect freedom, hath by nature power to preserve his property, that is, his life, liberty, and estate. We must, he says, quote, remember that absolute monarchs are but men, and we therefore have a right to question our government and to investigate the nature of its operations. Citing Paul's letter to Timothy, Locke writes, quote, God has given us all things richly, and so it's to him that we owe our allegiance. The nearest place where we can where we find the image of God and where we can pay back this debt is in our neighbor, who's created, as the Bible says, in the image of God. So it follows then in Locke's philosophy that the best way to truly safeguard the liberty of ourselves and our neighbors is to restrict the authority of government. Locke writes, hence, it is evident that absolute monarchy, by which some men is counted the only government in the world, is indeed inconsistent with civil society, and so can be no form of civil government at all. For the end of civil society is to avoid and remedy those inconveniences of the state of nature which necessarily follow from every man's being judge in his own case by setting up a known authority. So basically the purpose of government is to avoid the kind of anarchy that would ensue if everyone was just sort of advocating his or her own cause. But he that thinks absolute power purifies men's bloods and corrects the baseness of human nature need read but the history of this or any age to be convinced to the contrary. So Hobbes, by creating a model of absolute government called the Leviathan, uses Paul to encourage all citizens to submit themselves to the governing authorities. Locke, by contrast, uses Paul to emphasize the freedom we have as human beings. And for that freedom to be complete, it's necessary to diminish the agency of external factors, namely government, and ensure that they facilitate, rather than encroach upon, the liberty of citizens. This is the essence of liberalism as a philosophy and a political system, and thanks to Locke, it owes much of its conceptual structure to Paul. There's a fascinating sort of transformation taking place here in Locke's writings. When Locke preaches, for instance, that we are born free and that the natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth, he is in fact appropriating Paul's claims about the freedom we have in Christ. You, my brothers and sisters, are called to be free, Paul writes to the Galatians, and it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Consequently, what we as Americans see as our natural rights to liberty, inherited from Locke's arguments against a Hobbesian kind of totalitarian government, are part of Paul's legacy in Western politics and a testament to his afterlife today. Locke's affinity for Paul even extends to acting like him, and throughout his second treatise of government, Locke shrouds himself in a Pauline persona, as though he were Paul reborn in Renaissance England, preaching a new doctrine, the good news of liberty, to the huddling masses. We get hints of this in the precise theological words Locke employs. Freedom and liberty are fairly general and vague terms, although earlier in the 17th century, liberty is a bad term. If you say that you want liberty, then people assume you want it so you can do bad things. But by the later 17th century, it comes to be somewhat synonymous with freedom. However, Locke also uses another word, charity, which is quite different and has a specific theological meaning. Locke writes, for instance, of the true love of mankind and society and of the charity we owe to one another. And in 17th century England, that would have resonated with Locke's Renaissance readers. This is an old word that's mainly fallen out of the common English that we use today, but we know it by another word, grace. Grace is a newfangled Anglo-Saxon word, as our medievalists know, but charity comes from the Greek charis, caritas, which it just so happens is the favorite word of Paul and appears frequently in his epistles. Locke's use of this loaded term reveals the Pauline foundation of his political thought, and it suggests that he sees himself as something like Paul, bringing the message of Christian grace to those for whom it is a new and wonderful doctrine. So why does all of this matter for Constitution Week in the United States? Well, 100 years after Locke, the man who made liberty central to America's founding, the Republican theorist Thomas Jefferson, was an avid reader of Locke and a huge fan of his theories of liberalism and limited government. Just as we can see Paul's fingerprints all over Locke's writings, so too can we see Locke's fingerprints all over Jefferson's works. That Locke was a major influence on Jefferson is old news, and many scholarly books have been written about the relationship between the two men. So I'm just going to focus on two quick examples, the Declaration of Independence, and then the second example has to do with James Madison and the Constitution. When Jefferson writes in the Declaration, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights," we hear echoes of Locke's claim that we are, quote, born free, and that we've been given certain rights by God, in whose image we are made, that cannot be divorced from our persons. When Jefferson says in the Declaration that among these basic rights are, quote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, this is almost a direct echo of Locke, who preached that each man has a right to, quote, preserve his property, that is, his life, liberty, and estate. And that's not something that I've discovered. That's something that other political philosophers and historians have noted. As scholars of American political philosophy have long observed, Lockean liberalism is resurrected anew in Jefferson's Declaration, but I would add that with it comes all of the Pauline intellectual apparatus that helped define Lockean liberalism. In this way, American republicanism of the late 18th century, with its focus on citizens' rights, decentralized government, a weak executive branch and a strong legislative branch, is the heir not only of Locke, but of Paul. Paul's favorite teaching that we should, quote, stand firm in the liberty for which Christ has made us free, is reborn via Locke in Jefferson's decision to preach a new doctrine of his own, a doctrine that proclaims freedom and liberty for all people. Jefferson, however, does not stop there. Jefferson is one of the premier political theorists of the American colonies, and he's deeply cognizant as well of Hobbes's Leviathan. While there are no obvious echoes of Hobbes in the Declaration, as there are of Locke, there are, however, a number of passages that paint King George III as a Hobbesian sovereign. a tyrant, a despot, a ruler who amasses all power to himself with no regard for the welfare of his citizens. There's a reason, a very smart reason, by the way, that Jefferson does not even have echoes of Locke, however fitting he might have thought they were for King George III. If you even have echoes of Hobbes, if you have echoes of Hobbes, other political philosophers and contemporary intellectuals are going to pick up on that. They're going to know that you've been reading Thomas Hobbes, and even the idea that you've been reading Thomas Hobbes is somewhat scandalous in the Renaissance and in the 18th century. You don't want to be named a Hobbist, which is synonymous with atheist and bad person. Anyway, but he does paint King George III with a sort of Hobbesian color. Quote, he has dissolved the representative houses repeatedly, Jefferson writes, making his own executive branch the sole source of government. Here are some other examples. He has suspended our legislatures. He has obstructed the administration of justice. He has imposed taxes on us without our consent. In every stage of these oppressions, Jefferson writes, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Though Jefferson does not cite Hobbes, George is a spitting image of a Hobbesian tyrant and the very antithesis of what Locke, Paul, and Jefferson stand for. We might also consider the American Constitution, which was written largely by James Madison, a Federalist, not a Republican, who is deeply influenced also by Locke. Jefferson focused in particular on Locke's notion that property is the condition for liberty, and he expanded it to a massive scale so that each of the states has to have its own sovereignty in order for this American political system to work. But Madison is different. Madison desires a strong federal government, and so he focuses instead on the liberty that might be achieved through a strong legislative branch that can keep the executive in check. In Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, Madison writes, the House of Representatives shall choose their Speaker and other officers and shall have the sole power of impeachment. There they're talking about impeachment within the House, but it's important that he notes that check. Of the Senate as well, Madison writes, it shall have the sole power to try all impeachments. Though they had quite different ideas of what the United States should look like, one emphasizing states and the other emphasizing united, both Jefferson and Madison were concerned with the checks and balances in government that might simultaneously secure both liberty of the citizen and limitations upon the sovereign's authority. But at the same time, while Hobbes's ideas were abhorrent to Jefferson, they make a surprising reappearance in Madison's works and even in the Constitution. Again, no direct echoes. Madison is too smart for that also. In the centuries after Hobbes, it's perhaps impossible to imagine a strong political ruler without channeling a strong despotic political ruler who does not channel some sense of Hobbesian ideas. In the 20th century, for instance, the jurist Carl Schmitt drew heavily upon Hobbes when defending fascism and providing much of the political and ideological propaganda that supported Hitlerism in the Third Reich. To the extent that Schmitt has even been called by philosophers and jurists today the 20th century Hobbes. Madison as well, envisioning an America that would be unified and strong, channels Hobbesian ideas. In the letter he submits to Congress, for instance, which accompanied the Constitution, this is just the letter of transmittal, Madison wrote, it is obviously impractical in the federal government of these states to secure all rights of independent sovereignty to each, meaning to each citizen, and yet provide for the interest and safety of all. Individuals entering into society must give up a share of liberty to preserve the rest. The magnitude of the sacrifice must depend as well on situation and circumstance as on the object to be obtained. It is at all times difficult to draw with precision the line between those rights which must be surrendered and those which may be preserved. And on the present occasion, this difficulty was increased by a difference among the several states as to their situation, extent, habits, and interests. In this passage, it's interesting how much Madison's language resembles that of Hobbes. Hobbes had written, for instance, that without a strong government and a strong sovereign to lead it, life would be, quote, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. It's for this reason that citizens must submit themselves to the sovereign entirely, and in doing so they forfeit their claims to liberty. Madison doesn't go that far, but he certainly does emphasize that citizens have to give something up, some of their liberty, in order for this to work. The difference between Jefferson and Madison on this point might seem like we're splitting hairs, but I think there's actually an important distinction in illustrating which way they're approaching this. One emphasizing the complete liberty, the other emphasizing limitations upon liberty, and I think those are essentially Lockean and Hobbesian in their nature. We must, quote, give up a share of liberty, Madison says, so that we can all avoid the state of nature, which is the state of anarchy, where life is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. Were Madison to be reading Paul, he might well agree with Hobbes and with Jeff Sessions that the important part of Romans is this: submit yourselves to the governing authorities. Though Madison does not cite Paul directly in the letter of transmittal, there's a migration in the history of ideas taking place, and in Madison's Hobbesian tendencies, we can make out the glimpse of the work that Hobbes himself relied upon when preaching obedience, the 13th chapter of Romans. So in conclusion, I'd like to suggest that the presence of Paul in the political thought of Hobbes, Locke, Jefferson, and Madison complicates our understanding of secularism and the secular state. It's not that we in the West were once pre-secular and then secular and now are post-secular, as the famous philosopher Charles Taylor has argued. Instead, I would suggest this: we have never been secular. It follows that without Hobbes's totalitarianism, we would not have had Locke's liberalism, and without Locke's liberalism, we would not have had Jefferson's republicanism. But without Paul's writings of the freedom that we have in Christ, we would have had none of these. No matter how much they might have been diluted or changed over the years, Paul's ideas of freedom in Christ and the charis, the grace, that we owe to one another have shaped and will continue to shape our modern discussions of how much authority the government should hold over our lives. In this sense, because Paul is an ideological cornerstone for Hobbes and through him Madison, and for Locke and through him Jefferson, we can say that the Bible is playing an active role in our own political debates. And it teaches that while it is indeed good to obey the governing authorities, there exists a more important rule to love one another, and that when an unjust government obstructs that rule, we have permission to be very, very bad. Thank you.